The wind over Paradise Valley carried a sound that no man could mistake. A wolf's cry, long and haunting, echoing through the pines like a prayer torn from the earth itself. Months after releasing his companion back into the wild, Ben Walker, a retired Navy SEAL living alone in the Montana mountains, hears that cry again. But this time, it's closer. The same wolf he once saved as a dying pup, the one who vanished into the forest, has returned. Yet what steps out of the tree line isn't just a lone wolf, but a family, a living symbol of everything Ben has lost and learned to let go. What follows is not just a reunion, but a revelation about love, loyalty, and the wild freedom every soul longs for. Because sometimes, the ones we set free are the ones who lead us home again. If you've ever had to say goodbye to someone you love, or if you still believe that love finds its way back, drop a comment with where you're listening from, or simply write, Amen. This story is for you. Or, the wind came down the slopes of the Absaroka Range like a freight train, screaming, relentless, and cold enough to bite through bone. Snow swirled in furious spirals outside the small log cabin that sat half-buried in drifts. Inside, the fire in the iron stove had burned low, but Ben Walker didn't move to feed it. He sat in his worn recliner by the window, a half-empty mug of coffee cooling beside him, eyes lost in the white void beyond the frosted glass. At 68, Ben looked every bit the soldier he used to be. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw shadowed by a few days' stubble, silver hair cropped short the way the Navy had drilled into him decades ago. His face was carved by weather and war, creases at the corners of his eyes from squinting against sun and sand, and deeper lines from things he'd seen but never talked about. For 30 years he had served in the Navy SEALs, from Panama to Kandahar. He had faced death more times than he could count, but nothing in all that time had prepared him for life after. The house was too quiet now. Laura's laughter had once filled these rooms, soft, musical, the sound that made everything make sense. When cancer took her 2 winters ago, the silence that followed was unbearable. Then, just 3 months later, Ranger, his German shepherd, his partner in war and peace, had lain down by the fireplace one night and simply stopped breathing. 14 years old, a good soldier till the end. After that, Ben stopped talking much, stopped shaving every day. He spent his mornings splitting wood, his afternoons repairing things that didn't need fixing, and his evenings staring into the fire, wondering how a man who survived so much could still feel so empty. The clock ticked loudly. Outside, the storm thickened. He should have gone to bed, but some deep, restless pull made him get up, grab his parka, and open the door. The night slapped him in the face. Snow hammered sideways in sheets. He pulled his hood tighter and stepped onto the porch, the old wood creaking beneath his boots. For a moment, he thought he'd heard something, faint, almost swallowed by the wind. Then again, a high, sharp cry. Not wind, not the moan of old pines. It was something alive. Ben frowned, instinct kicking in. He'd followed sounds like that before. Injured men calling from rubble, children trapped under debris. His body remembered before his mind did. He grabbed a flashlight and started down the slope behind the cabin. The beam cut through the white chaos, revealing nothing but drifts and black trunks. His breath plumed in the air. Snow stung his cheeks like shards of glass. The cry came again, weaker now, from somewhere near the tree line. "Hang on," he muttered, though there was no one to hear him. He pushed forward, boots crunching through knee-deep snow, one gloved hand braced against the wind. The cold gnawed at his lungs, but he kept moving until the flashlight caught something dark against the white, something still. At first, he thought it was a fallen log. Then he saw the fur. A wolf. The animal lay half buried in snow, a female, her thick coat mottled gray and white. Her eyes were open but glassy. Blood had seeped into the snow beneath her shoulder, still red despite the cold. Ben crouched, breath clouding in the beam. The shot was clean, small caliber, maybe a poacher's rifle. "Damn it," he muttered. Wolves were protected here, but laws didn't mean much to desperate men. Then he heard it again, a small whimper right beside her. Ben brushed aside snow and froze. There, pressed against the dead mother's belly, was a pup no bigger than his two hands. Its fur was nearly black, its muzzle dusted silver, tiny sides fluttering with shallow breaths. Eyes still sealed shut. The sound it made, thin, gasping, hit Ben in a place he hadn't felt since Laura's hospital bed. He hesitated. The right thing was to call fish and wildlife. Let the professionals handle it. That's what the rules said. But rules didn't keep things alive in the middle of a Montana blizzard. "Hell with it," he whispered. He shrugged off his parka and laid it open in the snow. Carefully, he slid his hands beneath the pup. It was ice cold, limp. He tucked it against his chest inside the coat, feeling the faint heartbeat against his ribs. "Easy there, kid. Stay with me." The trek back felt twice as long. His legs ached, his breath came short, and by the time he reached the porch, he could barely feel his fingers. Inside, he kicked the door shut, dumped more logs into the stove, and knelt by the fire. The pup didn't move. Ben rubbed it with an old flannel towel, the same way he'd done with Ranger's first litter years ago during deployment. He remembered Laura laughing, telling him he was gentler with puppies than with people. When the pup finally gave a weak twitch, Ben exhaled. "That's it. You're not done yet." He found a mason jar of goat milk Laura had used for baking and warmed it on the stove. The dropper he used for his own medicine would have to do. He tested the milk on his wrist, old habit, and eased a drop into the tiny mouth. No response. Another drop. Then the smallest swallow. Ben grinned despite himself. "There you go, fighter." Minutes passed. Slowly, the rhythm of breathing steadied. The pup's fur, once matted with frost, began to fluff with warmth. Ben wrapped it in a wool blanket and set it near the fire. He sat back, muscles trembling from exhaustion, and looked at the tiny thing curled inside his coat. A wolf. The wildest creature in these mountains, and yet somehow, tonight, the only heartbeat in the world that made him feel alive again. Outside, the storm howled like a warning, rattling the windows. Ben didn't care. He poured himself a shot of whiskey, lifted the glass in the pup's direction, and said softly, "Welcome to Paradise Valley. Kid, guess we're both strays now." The wind screamed louder, but inside the cabin, for the first time in months, Ben felt something other than grief. He felt purpose. And in that fragile warmth between firelight and storm, a bond began. One that neither law, nor distance, nor death would ever quite undo. The storm had broken by morning, leaving a silence that was almost holy. Snow draped the valley in a clean white hush, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin roof settling under its new weight. Inside, the fire had burned down to a steady orange glow, Ben Walker sat cross-legged beside it, still in his flannel and thermals, the lines of exhaustion etched deep into his face. The little wolf pup slept in a bundle of towels near the stove, its fur black as coal dust, rising and falling with fragile breaths. He had spent most of the night keeping it alive, feeding warm goat milk from a dropper, rubbing its paws and belly to stir its circulation, whispering nonsense just to keep himself awake. He'd done this once before, long ago, with Ranger, when the shepherd had been a handful of fur and ribs rescued from a roadside box. Now, years later, Ben felt something he hadn't in a long time: responsibility. When the pup stirred, letting out a tiny whimper, he smiled. "All right, soldier. You made it through the night." He reached down and brushed a thumb over the soft fur between its ears. "You're darker than a cave at midnight," he murmured. "Guess we'll call you Shadow." The name seemed to fit. The pup stretched weakly, nuzzling against his palm, and Ben felt a tug in his chest that startled him. He hadn't realized how much he needed this, a heartbeat other than his own inside these four walls. He fed Shadow again, one careful drop at a time. The pup swallowed, slow but steady. The knock came just as he was setting the bottle down. A firm, deliberate rap, 3 times, official sounding. Ben froze. No one visited unannounced up here unless something was wrong. He opened the door to a woman in a dark green parka with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service patch on the sleeve. Her hood was down, revealing shoulder-length auburn hair tied back in a low ponytail. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, freckles scattered across fair skin. She looked mid-30s, lean, with that posture that said military before she even spoke. "Mr. Walker?" Her voice was calm, professional. "I'm Casey Hart, regional wildlife biologist. Got a report of gunfire near your property last night. Mind if I come in?" Ben hesitated but stepped aside. "Doors open." She wiped her boots and entered, scanning the room in one practiced glance. The stove, the drying parka, the faint bloodstains on the towel by the fire. Her eyes landed on the small black shape curled in front of the hearth. Her tone hardened. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." Ben exhaled. "Found her dead. Shot clean through. Pup was still breathing underneath." Casey crouched by the fire. Up close, she smelled faintly of cedar and cold air. Her hands were steady as she pulled off her gloves and inspected the pup. "Male," she said softly. "No more than 2 weeks old. You shouldn't have touched him." "He would have frozen. I understand," she said, glancing up. "But wolves are federally protected. Keeping one without authorization is a violation of the Endangered Species Act." Ben crossed his arms. "I'm not keeping him. I'm saving him." She looked at him for a long moment, reading the stubborn set of his jaw. "You're a SEAL, right? I recognize the trident tattoo." He didn't answer. "I was Army Medical Corps," she continued. "Afghanistan. Lost a good chunk of my hearing to an IED. So believe me, I know what it's like to think you can fix something the world's already decided to let die." Her words hit harder than he expected. She straightened. "Here's the deal. That pup needs formula, heat, and hourly feeding. The nearest rehab facility's in Helena, 3 hours if the roads are clear. They're not clear today." "So he won't make it," Ben said quietly. Casey studied him. "Maybe not." He met her gaze, blue eyes steady as steel. "Then give me 72 hours. I'll stabilize him. After that, you can take him wherever you need." "That's not how it works." It's how it's gonna work tonight. Something in his tone, discipline, grief, command, made her pause. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, exhaled a white fog of breath, and finally nodded. 72 hours, but I'm coming back to check. You so much as try to make a pet out of him, I'm filing paperwork before you can say Miranda rights. Ben's mouth twitched. You always this friendly? She allowed herself a small smile. You should have seen me before my second cup of coffee. She pulled a small case from her pack, setting it on the table. Puppy formula, vitamins, a feeding syringe. It'll buy you some time. Ben took the supplies. Appreciate it. Casey zipped up her coat. Don't thank me yet. You're walking a thin line, Mr. Walker. When she left, the cold rushed in behind her. Ben closed the door, leaned his forehead against it for a second, and sighed. Shadow whimpered again. Yeah, Ben muttered, moving back to the fire. You and your new babysitter just made me an outlaw. He fed the pup until its belly was round and warm, then set it on a folded blanket beside him. The tiny creature twitched in sleep, one paw flexing as if chasing something in a dream. Ben poured himself coffee from the old percolator. He thought about Casey, her straight-backed stance, the sharpness in her eyes that came from seeing too much, the way she'd said Afghanistan like a scar she didn't want to show. He understood that kind of silence. Outside, the sun broke through for a moment, scattering light over the snow. The world looked untouched, pure, yet somewhere out there was the man who'd pulled the trigger that killed Shadow's mother. Ben stared into the fire. I know how you feel, kid, he murmured. Some things die too early, and you don't get to ask why. Shadow stirred and made a soft sound, half sigh, half growl. Ben smiled faintly. That's right. You rest. You'll need your strength. He sat there for hours, feeding, wiping, checking the temperature, moving with a precision that was half habit, half prayer. The discipline that had once kept him alive in war now kept this tiny life breathing. When dusk fell, the fire threw long amber shadows across the walls. Shadow's breathing deepened, his small body now radiating warmth. Outside, the wind had quieted to a whisper. Ben reached over and brushed a bit of soot from the pup's fur. Welcome to the fight, Shadow, he said softly. You're gonna make it. And for the first time in years, Ben didn't dread tomorrow. Morning sunlight filtered through the cabin's frost-rimmed windows, painting long stripes across the wooden floor. The air smelled of coffee, cedar smoke, and something new. Life. Shadow was no longer the fragile scrap Ben had carried home from the snow. His eyes had opened 2 days ago, amber gold, bright and unblinking, like tiny lanterns catching the firelight. His fur had thickened to a soft sheen, still black, but streaked faintly with silver along the spine. He stumbled when he walked, but every hour he grew stronger. Ben watched him from his chair by the hearth, a faint grin tugging at his mouth. You've got Ranger's stubbornness, he muttered, and my appetite. The pup lifted its head, tilted it as if recognizing the name, then sneezed. Ben chuckled, a sound so rusty it startled even him. He had built a rhythm again, something resembling order. Every 4 hours he warmed Shadow's formula, fed him with the syringe, then set him on the rug to explore. The pup nosed boots, chewed at chair legs, and sometimes dozed inside one of Ben's old combat boots like it was a den. Discipline, Ben thought. That's what keeps things alive. He had lived his whole life by that word. Discipline through pain, through loss. After retirement, he had tried to live without it, and everything had unraveled. Now, with Shadow, the clock mattered again. 0600 feed, 0800 walk, 1200 nap, and so on. Purpose had returned disguised as a wild creature. 3 days later, Casey Hart's green SUV pulled up outside. Ben opened the door before she could knock. She stepped out, brushing snow off her parka. Her face was pink from the cold, her auburn hair tied into a tighter ponytail than last time. "Still alive?" she called, smiling faintly. "Both of us," Ben said. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I brought more formula and deworming meds, and coffee, strong enough to wake a corpse." "Perfect," Ben said. "That's my usual state." Casey crouched beside Shadow, who was gnawing on the hem of Ben's blanket. "He's stronger than I expected." "Guess he didn't get the memo about dying," Ben said, pouring 2 mugs. Casey studied him over the rim of her coffee. "You've done well, but you know this can't last. When he starts eating meat, his instincts kick in. Wolves don't stay tame." Ben met her eyes. "I'm not trying to tame him. I'm just giving him a chance." She nodded slowly. "That's fair." Something in her voice softened. Maybe it was recognition. The way trauma recognizes itself in silence. She glanced at the photos on the mantel. Laura in a summer dress, smiling beside a younger Ben. And next to her, a framed picture of a German shepherd with alert eyes and 1 torn ear. "Your wife?" she asked quietly. Ben nodded. "Laura. Cancer took her 2 winters ago. Ranger went a few months later. Old heart just gave out." "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it, he shrugged. "Life doesn't wait for permission." They didn't speak for a while. The fire popped softly, Shadow's tiny claws clicking across the floor. Casey finally stood, brushing her knees. "I'll be back in a few days. Call me if anything changes. Temperature, appetite, anything." Ben smiled faintly. "You always talk like you're giving orders." "Force of habit," she said, pulling on her gloves. "Comes with the uniform. So does worrying about stubborn old soldiers." When she left, the cabin felt too quiet again. But Shadow filled that space fast. Within hours, he was yipping at his reflection in the stove door, chasing dust motes, then collapsing mid-play into deep sleep. That evening, Ben was cleaning his rifle, an old habit he couldn't quite quit, when headlights cut across the window. A pickup truck rolled up the drive, crunching over frozen gravel. "Adam," Ben murmured, setting the gun aside. His son stepped out, slamming the door shut against the cold. Adam was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, but cleaner, smoother. His hair was sandy brown, his jacket city new. He carried himself like a man used to offices, not mountains. "Dad," he greeted, stamping snow off his boots as he came inside. "You weren't answering your phone again." "Signal's trash out here," Ben said. "Coffee?" Adam's gaze drifted to the small dark shape curled on the blanket by the fire. "Is that a wolf?" Ben sighed. "Found him after the storm. Mother was dead." "You're kidding. Dad, that's illegal. You can't just—" "I know what it is," Ben cut in. "Then why risk it?" Adam's voice rose, sharp with frustration. "You're out here alone, no help, and now you've got a wild animal in your house." Ben turned back to the stove, poking the fire. "He's just a pup." "That pup's gonna grow teeth the size of your fingers," Adam snapped. "Sell this place, come back to Bozeman. There's a condo near the river. Closer to us. To people." I like my people right where they are, Ben said evenly. Adam ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. Mom would have wanted you safe. Ben froze, jaw tightening. Your mother would have wanted me alive, Adam. This, he gestured to the cabin, to the small beating heart beside the fire. This is the first thing that's made me feel that way in 2 years. Adam's anger faded, replaced by something heavier. Pity. You think this wolf's gonna fix that hole? It won't, Dad. You can't replace family with ghosts. Ben didn't answer. The silence stretched until Adam sighed, pulling on his gloves. I'll call again next week, he said quietly. Just don't let this go too far. When the truck's taillights disappeared down the mountain road, Ben stood in the doorway for a long time, watching snow drift through the beam of his porch light. Inside, Shadow stirred, sensing the tension. He padded over, sat by Ben's boots, and looked up with those steady amber eyes. Ben knelt, scratching behind his ear. Don't worry, kid. We're not going anywhere. Shadow licked his hand, tail flicking once before curling up against his leg. The old soldier smiled faintly, the weight in his chest easing just a little. He poured another cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the dark roll down from the mountains. The fire glowed behind him, casting 2 silhouettes, one large, one small, onto the wall. And for the first time in a long time, Ben didn't see ghosts in the shadows. He saw tomorrow. By late spring, the snow had melted off the peaks, leaving the valley washed in green and gold. The creek behind Ben's cabin ran thick with meltwater, carrying the sharp smell of pine and mud. For the first time in years, Ben felt the rhythm of the land again, chopping wood at dawn, patching the fence by noon, and sitting on the porch in the evenings with a cup of coffee and a shadow at his feet. Shadow had grown into a sleek, powerful creature, no longer the fragile bundle from winter. His fur was deep black with faint gray streaks along his shoulders, his eyes a striking amber that seemed to hold more understanding than any animal should. He was lean and strong, already the size of a large German shepherd, but with a certain restless grace, the kind that belonged to something that could never be tamed. Ben tried to keep structure. He built a fenced area behind the cabin, reinforced it with wire, and gave Shadow room to roam. But the wolf's instincts were stronger than the boards that tried to contain them. One morning, Ben woke to the faint sound of barking and a woman's voice calling from down the slope. He stepped outside, pulling on his jacket. Helen Johnson, the neighbor from 2 miles down, stood near her chicken coop, her red flannel coat unbuttoned and hair tied up under a knit cap. She was in her mid-50s, heavy-set but lively, the kind of woman who never ran out of opinions. Her cheeks were flushed with anger. "Ben Walker!" she shouted, waving a broken fence slat. "Your thing killed one of my hens." Ben's stomach sank. Are you sure it was him? Black as midnight, yellow eyes. How many of those you got running around here? She snapped. I found feathers all over the yard. You better get that wolf of yours under control, or I'll be calling the county. I'll make it right, Ben said quietly. I'll pay for it. I don't care about the money, Ben. I care about safety. That animal ain't a pet, and you know it. She turned and stomped back toward her truck, slamming the door hard enough to make the birds scatter. Ben ran a hand over his face. The guilt hit harder than he expected. When he reached the pen, Shadow was waiting, tail low, muzzle flecked with feathers. The young wolf's ears flattened under Ben's stare. Damn it, Ben whispered. What did you do? Shadow lowered himself to the ground, whining softly. Ben's anger faded as fast as it had come. He couldn't blame the creature for being what it was. Instinct didn't know fences or laws. 2 hours later, Casey Hart's SUV pulled into the driveway. She climbed out with her clipboard and sunglasses, her expression already stern. "I got a report," she said simply. "From Helen Johnson." Ben sighed. "Yeah, one of her hens." He got out. Casey crouched, inspecting the fence. "You reinforced this yourself?" "Every inch." "Then he's smarter than I thought," she saw, straightened, crossing her arms. "You know I have to file an incident report. If it happens again, the department could order removal. That means relocation, possibly permanent." Ben looked away, jaw tight. "You mean taking him away?" "I mean protecting him from being shot the next time he crosses someone's property line." Her tone softened when she saw his expression. "Ben, I know what he means to you, but he's not yours to keep." He didn't answer. The words cut deeper than she probably realized. That evening, Ben repaired the hole Shadow had dug under the fence, double-layered the wire, and stayed outside with him until the stars came out. Shadow paced the pen's edge, restless, sniffing the wind. Something wild shimmered in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe longing. "Yeah," Ben murmured. "I know the feeling." The next few days passed quietly. Ben tried to keep Shadow busy, teaching him small commands. Stay, back, quiet, things he'd once taught Ranger. Shadow listened when he wanted to, but sometimes, when the wind shifted, he'd freeze. Ears perked toward the woods, like hearing a call only he could understand. Then, one afternoon, while Ben was out splitting firewood near the shed, the forest went silent. The birds stopped calling. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Shadow stiffened, fur bristling. "What is it?" Ben asked, setting down the axe. The answer came in a low, rumbling grunt, deep, close, and heavy. From the tree line, a massive shape emerged, a grizzly, gaunt from a long winter, eyes sunken with hunger. It moved with the slow, deliberate gait of something that knew it was feared. Ben's pulse surged. He backed toward the cabin, but the bear's attention was already fixed on him. Then Shadow moved. The young wolf darted forward, hackles raised, a snarl tearing from his throat. Raw, fierce, alive. He planted himself between Ben and the bear, circling, teeth bared. "Shadow!" Ben shouted. "Back!" But instinct ruled now. The bear lunged, swiping with claws that could split bone. Shadow ducked and lunged in turn, sinking teeth into its flank. The bear roared, twisting, snapping, but Shadow was faster, feinting left, darting right, keeping the beast's attention off the man behind him. Ben grabbed his axe and shouted, slamming it against a tree to make noise. The bear hesitated, bleeding from its shoulder, then turned and lumbered back toward the woods, vanishing among the pines with a final crash of branches. The silence that followed felt endless. Ben dropped the axe and ran to Shadow. The wolf was on his side, panting, a long gash along his shoulder where the bear's claws had caught him. Blood matted the dark fur. "Easy, boy," Ben whispered, kneeling beside him. "You're okay. You're okay." He pressed his hands against the wound, feeling the warm slickness between his fingers. Shadow whimpered once but didn't pull away. Ben's throat tightened. "You saved me," he murmured, voice breaking. "You damn fool. You saved me." He carried the bleeding wolf inside, laid him by the fire, and wrapped the wound as best he could. His old training steadied his hands, but not his heart. When Shadow finally drifted into uneasy sleep, Ben sat beside him, staring into the flames. He knew what Casey had said was true. Shadow was wild, born to the call of the mountains, not the quiet of a cabin. And for the first time, Ben understood. Love couldn't cage what was meant to run free. January arrived like a whisper made of ice. The valley lay buried under snow, the kind that silenced even the river. At night, the moon floated pale and full above the Absaroka peaks, turning the landscape to silver. Inside the cabin, Ben sat near the fire, his cane leaning against the wall. The faint limp in his left leg from an old injury had grown worse with the cold. He rubbed it absently, listening to the wind hum through the chimney. Shadow was sprawled by the hearth, bigger than ever now. Nearly 90 pounds of rippling muscle and dark fur. His coat glowed faintly red under the firelight, his amber eyes half closed, yet alert to every sound. There was a calm in him tonight, but also a tension, like a wire pulled too tight. Ben noticed. He always did. "You hear something?" he asked quietly. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricking toward the window. Then, faint and far, the sound came. A howl. Long, low, mournful. It rolled down from the ridge like a memory older than time. Another answered. Then another. A pack. Shadow stood, tail stiff, every muscle alive. His gaze met Ben's for a long second, wild, questioning, almost apologetic. Then he turned toward the door, pacing. Ben's chest tightened. "Easy, boy. Stay." But instinct had its own language. The wolf padded to the door, pressed his nose to the wood, and whined. Soft, urgent. Ben didn't move to stop him. He simply opened the door. The night air swept in, sharp as broken glass. Shadow looked back once, eyes gleaming gold in the firelight. "Go on then," Ben whispered, "but come back." And just like that, he was gone. A shadow vanishing into snow. The cabin felt enormous without him. The silence crept in, heavy and absolute. Ben tried to tell himself Shadow would return. He always did. But the old man found himself standing at the window every few minutes, staring at the white emptiness beyond the porch. When dawn broke, the horizon blushed pink with cold. Ben had dozed off in his chair, blanket around his shoulders. A scratching noise woke him. At the door. He opened it to find Shadow standing there, his fur matted with snow, chest heaving, eyes wild. He smelled of pine and blood and freedom. "Where the hell did you go?" Ben muttered, though his voice shook with relief. Shadow brushed past him and collapsed by the stove, curling up with a deep sigh. Ben knelt beside him, running his hand through the coarse fur. Beneath the scent of forest was something else, the smell of other wolves. "You found them, didn't you?" Ben said softly. "You're kind." Shadow's tail twitched, but his eyes stayed closed. Days turned to weeks. The pattern repeated. Some nights, Shadow would vanish, returning hours later, or sometimes not until morning, body crusted with frost, paws bleeding from ice. Yet he always came back. Always. Ben learned not to wait by the window, though he never quite succeeded. Each time the wolf returned, he'd check for wounds, brush out the fur, whisper something that wasn't quite prayer and wasn't quite forgiveness. Casey stopped by once, bundled in her thick winter jacket, a knitted beanie pulled low over her auburn hair. "He's still leaving, huh?" she asked, watching Shadow sleep near the fire. "Yeah," Ben said. "But he comes home." Her eyes softened. "You know that won't last forever, right?" Ben didn't answer. He didn't have to. She reached out, resting a gloved hand on his shoulder. "Call me if anything changes. Anything." He nodded. When she left, the cabin felt even quieter than before. Then came the day everything changed. It was late afternoon, the air brittle and clear. Ben was out in the yard splitting kindling, breath fogging the air. Shadow was nearby, prowling the snowdrifts, nose to the ground. The pain hit without warning, a sharp explosion behind his eye, followed by numbness down his right side. The axe slipped from his grip. His knees buckled. The snow rose up to meet him. He tried to call out, but the words came slurred, broken. His vision swam. One arm refused to move. Shadow. The wolf was there in seconds, whining, nudging his shoulder. Ben's breath came ragged, shallow. He couldn't feel his leg, couldn't get up. Shadow circled him in panic, barking, a deep, desperate sound. He pawed at Ben's coat, then froze, ears flicking toward the distant road. A faint hum. An engine. Shadow took off. On the highway below the ridge, Casey Hart was driving her old green SUV, scanning the tree line for movement. She had been checking traps, her thermos half empty beside her, when a dark blur shot across the snow in front of her headlights. She hit the brakes. "Shadow?" she breathed. The wolf stood in the middle of the road, chest heaving, eyes locked on hers. Then he turned and bolted uphill, pausing every few steps to glance back, barking sharply, the unmistakable sound of "Follow me." "Jesus," Casey muttered, throwing the truck into park. She grabbed her medical bag and started after him. The climb was brutal. Snow grabbed at her boots, and the cold bit into her lungs. But Shadow stayed in sight, darting ahead, pausing, urging her on. When she finally reached the clearing, she saw Ben sprawled in the snow, his face pale, his breath shallow. "Ben!" she cried, dropping to her knees. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, pulse, faint but steady. "Stroke," she said under her breath, already pulling out the emergency pack from her bag. She positioned him on his side, cleared his airway, then grabbed her radio. "This is Hart. I need medical evac at Paradise Ridge, East Cabin. Possible cerebrovascular event. Patient stable but critical." The dispatcher confirmed, voice crackling. "ETA, 10 minutes. Shadow stood close, pressing his body against Ben's side, refusing to move even when Casey tried to shift him. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, glancing at the wolf. "You did good. You saved him." The wolf looked at her once, calm, knowing, then turned his gaze back to Ben as the wail of sirens climbed the mountain. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and old linoleum, a smell Ben Walker had always hated. He had spent too many years in military wards, where pain echoed down white halls. Now the smell clung to his own skin. 3 weeks had passed since the stroke. His right arm was still stiff, and his words slurred when he was tired. But every day he forced himself through the physical therapy, slow, stubborn repetitions that made the nurse shake her head in disbelief. "You're healing faster than most men half your age," she said one morning. Her name was Margaret Lewis. a plump woman in her 50s with kind gray eyes and a habit of humming hymns under her breath. "Discipline," Ben muttered, sweat running down his temple. "It's what keeps you alive." By the end of the month, he was strong enough to walk with a cane, and when the doctor discharged him, Casey Hart was the one waiting by the hospital doors. She stood beside her old green SUV, wrapped in a brown coat lined with fur. The Montana wind whipped her auburn hair loose from its tie. Her expression was warm but cautious, the look of someone who'd seen too many people go back to lives that hurt them. "You sure you're ready?" she asked. Ben nodded. "I've been ready since they put me in that damn bed." She helped him into the passenger seat. As they drove toward Paradise Valley, the world spread out, vast, white, endless. The sun hung low over the ridges, and Ben's cabin appeared at last, small but standing proud against the snow. When he opened the door, a familiar shape leapt from the porch. Shadow. The wolf was nearly full-grown now, sleek and broad-shouldered, his black coat gleaming like polished stone. He bounded up, tail wagging in wide arcs, then slowed, as if remembering the human's fragility. He pressed his head against Ben's leg, whining softly. Ben dropped his cane and sank to one knee, burying his fingers in the thick fur. "Missed you, kid." Shadow licked his hand, careful, reverent. Casey smiled. "He's been staying with me. Wouldn't eat much until you were out of the woods." Ben looked up at her, eyes misted. "Guess he's more loyal than some people I served with." She chuckled, then grew serious. "Ben, we need to talk about him, about what comes next." Inside, they sat by the fire, mugs of coffee steaming between them. Casey pulled a small tablet from her bag, showing maps and satellite images dotted with markers. "This is a soft release plan," she explained. "It's designed for wolves raised in partial captivity. We'd fit him with a GPS collar, condition him to avoid human scents, and place feeding sites deep in the range. He'd still have a chance to survive, and you'd still know where he is." Ben's eyes lingered on the screen. "You mean let him go?" "It's what's best for him." Her tone was gentle but firm. "You've done your part. You saved him. Now you have to let him be what he was born to be." Ben stared into the fire for a long time. Flames reflected in his eyes like memories he couldn't hold on to. "You ever lose something you weren't ready to let go of?" Casey looked down at her hands. "My brother," she said quietly. "IED in Kandahar. I kept his dog for years, thinking I could fill the hole. But some things, they don't want filling. They just need to be honored." Her voice broke slightly, then steadied. "You taught Shadow to trust again. Now it's time to teach him freedom." Ben exhaled, slow and heavy. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it your way." 2 mornings later, the snow had begun to melt. A thin fog hung between the pines. Casey arrived with a small team, 2 rangers from the Wildlife Division, both in their 30s, clean-shaven and quiet. They wore padded gloves and carried the tranquilizer kit. Ben stepped out onto the porch, Shadow beside him. The wolf's nose twitched, sensing the tension. "No darts," Ben said. "He trusts me. Let me do it." Casey hesitated, then nodded. Ben knelt, holding the metal collar in his weathered hands. "Easy, Shadow," he murmured. "Just a little gear. Nothing you can't handle." The wolf stood perfectly still as the clasp clicked shut around his neck. A small blinking light flashed once, twice. Casey's voice was soft. "Signals live." Ben rested a hand on Shadow's head. The fur was warm beneath his fingers. "You remember Ranger?" he whispered. "He taught me loyalty. You taught me to let go." His voice caught. "Ranger, Shadow, you can go now." For a moment, Shadow didn't move. Then, with a low, uncertain whine, he stepped backward, watching Ben's face as if memorizing it. Finally, he turned and bounded toward the tree line, disappearing into the fog. Ben stood long after the forest swallowed him, his breath clouded in the cold air. Casey came to stand beside him. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, he's where he belongs." They watched the blinking light on the tracker move slowly across the digital map, up the ridge, toward the wilderness. When it finally stopped flashing, Ben smiled faintly. Freedom suits him. Casey looked at him, understanding. "It suits you too." The old soldier chuckled, the sound quiet but full. "Maybe it does." They turned toward the cabin as the sun broke through the fog, spilling gold across the snow. The forest was alive again. And for the first time, Ben Walker felt at peace, not because he had something to hold on to, but because he had finally learned how to let go. Spring crept quietly into Paradise Valley, turning the snowmelt into ribbons of silver that trickled down the mountains. The pines shimmered with new needles, and the air smelled of thawed earth and wood smoke. Ben Walker sat on the porch of the Wildlife Center, where he now spent most of his mornings, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hands. The center wasn't much. A long wooden building with a faded green roof, a barn-turned workshop behind it, and a gravel path that curved toward the forest. But to Ben, it was enough. After all he'd lost and after all he'd let go, enough finally felt like peace. He was part of a new outreach program Casey had started that spring, Veterans for the Wild. Its mission was simple: teach former service members to build and maintain motion-triggered cameras used to study wildlife migration. The work gave them purpose, connection, and a way to trade old scars for something living. Ben adjusted a camera on the work table, his thick fingers surprisingly steady. Beside him, a tall man with a prosthetic arm was sanding down a mounting frame. That was Tom Riker, 42, a former Army Ranger with a sharp jawline, a weather-beaten face, and a habit of whistling tunelessly when he concentrated. He'd lost his arm to an explosion in Mosul, but he talked about it the same way most men talked about a bad back, nothing more than an inconvenience. "Not bad for a bunch of old warhorses, huh?" Tom said, tightening the bolt with his one good hand. Ben grinned. "We've broken worse things and made them work." Casey Hart emerged from the office, clipboard tucked under her arm. The afternoon light caught the faint streaks of gray now showing in her auburn hair. She looked tired but satisfied, the kind of tired that comes from building something worthwhile. "All right, team," she called. "Wrap up for the day. We'll hike out to check the ridge cameras next week. Forecast says the elk herds are moving early this season." Tom packed up his tools and slapped Ben's shoulder on the way out. "See you tomorrow, old man." "Keep dreaming," Ben said. When the trucks rolled out and the sound of engines faded, quiet returned to the valley. Casey lingered, leaning on the porch rail beside him. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked softly. Ben sipped his coffee. "Sometimes. Then I remember there's nowhere else I'd rather watch the sun set." She smiled at that. "He's still out there, you know. Shadow. We picked up the collar signal last month, up near the Yellowstone boundary. He's been traveling with a small pack." Ben nodded. He was meant for that. They stood together for a long time, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. When Casey left, Ben stayed on the porch. The sky blushed into gold and pink, then deepened toward dusk. He listened to the wind move through the aspens, carrying with it the faint call of distant life. Coyotes, ravens, the whisper of the wild he had helped return. Then, just as he lifted his mug for another sip, something stirred near the tree line. A dark shape moved through the brush, slow, deliberate, familiar. Ben froze. Shadow stepped into the clearing. He was enormous now, nearly 100 pounds, his fur a deep black glossed with silver along the shoulders, his eyes burning with the steady amber light Ben remembered. He stood taller, prouder, but there was no mistaking him. For a moment, neither moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Ben set his mug down carefully. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "You came home." Shadow didn't come closer, not right away. He stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching. And then Ben saw them, two smaller shapes emerging from behind the pines. Pups. They tumbled into view, clumsy and curious, their coats a mottled mix of black and gray. One tripped over its own paw and rolled in the grass, yipping. The other sniffed the air, cautious but unafraid. And behind them, a third figure appeared, a she-wolf, her coat a soft gray brushed with white around the muzzle. She was lean, graceful, her eyes sharp and watchful. Ben's heart swelled and ached all at once. Shadow turned to nudge the she-wolf gently, then looked back at Ben. The gesture was unmistakable. "This is my family." The old soldier swallowed hard. "You did good, kid," he whispered. "You found your place." Shadow took a few steps closer. The pups froze, unsure. The she-wolf stayed near the trees, wary but calm. The distance between man and wolf felt both impossibly wide and heartbreakingly small. Ben didn't move to bridge it. He knew better. Love, he had learned, wasn't about holding on. It was about knowing when not to. So he just sat there on the porch, the wood creaking under his boots, and lifted his coffee in quiet salute. "Welcome home," he said softly. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound. Then he turned, brushing his muzzle against the pups, as if to tell them it was time. The little ones bounded ahead, their tiny paws scattering leaves, and the she-wolf followed. At the edge of the forest, Shadow paused one last time. Their eyes met. Amber to blue, wild to weary. Then he was gone. The clearing emptied into silence again, broken only by the rustle of wind through the grass. Ben leaned back in his chair. The sun slipped below the mountains, and a single star blinked to life above the ridge. He could almost feel Laura beside him, the warmth of her hand resting over his, and in the quiet hum of the valley, he imagined the steady breathing of Ranger at his feet, the family he'd lost, and the one he'd helped another creature find. He smiled. Not the forced kind, but the easy, earned kind of a man who has finally made peace with every goodbye. "Yeah," he whispered to the fading horizon. "They'd be proud." The light faded, and the air cooled. But Ben stayed a while, longer, watching the forest breathe. Somewhere far off, a wolf's howl rose through the twilight, not lonely, but whole. And Ben Walker, for the first time in his life, felt the world was exactly as it should be.